Afternoon, everyone. Thanks for coming back. We're gonna start in just a minute, waiting for people to join. Had a great morning and looking forward to continuing our presentations and discussions. And so as we're heading into topic number 4, which is the Floodmore pilot projects and research studies, want to let everybody know, just as a reminder, that at 4:15 we are going to have 2 breakout rooms. One is going to be a conversation with the Merced team to provide time for questions and discussion. We will also have a breakout room for the tribal water stories, which is going to be very interesting about documenting tribal stories, both the written word and a video. So feel free to go from one to the next and check out these different conversations. Our time with this group is scheduled until 4 o'clock, and we have a 15-minute break. But for those who want to stay on to continue discussion, we'll keep this room open. So stretch it a little bit since we don't have a breakout session for today. And with that logistics aside, I would like to introduce to you our moderator for this afternoon, Rosemary Knight. Rosemary and her environmental geophysics research group have worked for more than 30 years on the challenge of using geophysical methods for groundwater science and management. In 2008, Knight founded with Adam Pidlisecki the Center for Groundwater Evaluation and Management, with a vision of advancing and promoting the use of geophysical methods through the development of partnerships with water agencies. Collaboration with local and state agencies, moving knowledge into action, has been and remains central to Knight's work. And I think that phrase, knowledge into action, is going to be with us as we're listening to our presentations this afternoon. So very excited. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to you, Rosemary.
Great. Thank you very much, Arit, for that introduction. I'm going to share my screen, and it says I can't. Only 1 participant's allowed. Tommy, can I share my screen? Okay, good to go. Okay, so welcome everyone. Yes, this is topic 4, Floodmore example projects and research studies. I'm Rosemary Knight, and I'm the moderator today and also the first speaker, joined by Helen Dahlke, Michael Founds, and then we've got a 5-minute break with a poll question, and then Philip Bichond and Eric Batman, followed by a 15-minute Q&A period. So I'm going to get started here by talking about ways we're using geophysical methods, ground-based, helicopter deployed, to search for and assess recharge sites. So here's my simple schematic that I use a lot of the subsurface. The tree is not to scale. We have our target groundwater aquifer down there for recharge, 30, 40, 50, 100 meters below the ground surface. And what we're trying to do is think about this scenario. We spread water on the ground surface. Our target is finding interconnected pathways of coarse-grained material that can move that water efficiently down to get into our aquifer. And we're also interested in what's the connectivity of the aquifer system once it gets there. Where does this recharge water go? Finding these fast paths is an important part of selecting an optimal recharge site. One thing that's very important, it helps reassure growers that in the case of on-farm recharge, their land is not going to be flooded for long periods of time, which could potentially damage crops and make trees more susceptible to blowing over. So I'm going to start by talking about using a towed electromagnetic system, where we move the geophysical system across the ground surface, towing it behind an all-terrain vehicle. We've done work at a number of sites shown here in the Tulare Irrigation District. So huge thanks to Aaron Fukuda, who's always keen to help out every time I call him up with one of my knowledge into action ideas. So thanks to Aaron for helping set up the logistics of this, and local landowners for letting us and our TTEM system on their property. So TTEM was developed in Denmark at Aarhus University. Esben Aachen was one of the developers. And the moment they had an operating system, I flew Esben and TTEM to California. So October 2017, a team of us went out to Tulare Irrigation District and project led by Ahmed Baruzman. And I've just got a video here. I hope it plays. Here's the TTEM system. And they brought it across from Denmark, rapidly put it together at the field site. And we're working in an almond grove. The transmitter's up the front there, that big white loop, the receiver at the back, that brown box. This fit perfectly. It does fit perfectly between the rows of almond trees. I had people measure this I said, I'm not paying to fly this over if it's not going to fit. It fit. And we were able to drive between the rows of the almond trees, acquiring geophysical data up and down in these almond groves, pistachio groves. And the turning radius on this first version of the system was not great, but it's improved since. Working in recharge basins is even easier. You just drive this thing around. We covered 2 recharge basins in Tulare Irrigation District and just were able to acquire great data. Yeah, that's me driving the TTEM system. So what do we get? When we acquire all these data, we then invert them and get back this representation of the subsurface. So I'm showing here a slice starting at the ground, going down about 50 feet. That's typically the depth of investigation of this system. What we get is a map of electrical resistivity, these 2D slices everywhere we go of electrical resistivity. Now, electrical resistivity is sensitive to clay content, water content, salinity. And so we want to get that information out of our TTEM data. The horizontal resolution depends upon the speed at which you drive. So using average speed of driving along the lines, we've got these horizontal volumes. The horizontal sampling or the horizontal resolution is about 5 meters. Vertical resolution, you can resolve layers on the order of about 1 meter thick near the surface. That becomes about 3 meters thick at depth. And this is because of the physics of the measurement. The resolution degrades with depth. So this is an example of a resistivity model that we obtained at 2 of the sites. And this is Ahmed Baruzman, who led this project. What you're looking at here, so the almond grove is underneath. These data are sitting on top of the almond grove. They really are data that start below the ground surface. And you're looking at this 3-dimensional data set of resistivity values, 400 meters by 800 meters, going down to the water table, which is this site was at about 50 meters. What you're mapping out is electrical resistivity. The warm colors, the reds are coarse grain materials. The cool colors, the blues, are fine grain materials. And the results from all 7 sites where we worked. So we get this great look at the subsurface. Now the scales have changed, sorry. Red over here is much more resistive than red over here. But if we look at these 2 sites, subjectively, qualitatively, we can immediately say, if I can put floodwater anywhere, I'm going to pick site 4, not site 5, because there's a lot of clay showing up. A lot of these cool colors, these fine grain materials at site 5. So this gives us a way of getting an understanding of what type of materials are present at a site. The time it takes to acquire data like this, I'm checking my timer for myself. Site 1, 6 hours. That was our first site. Site 2, smaller, 30 minutes. Site 4, 4 hours. By the time we were at site 6 and 7, I think I was driving here, done in less than an hour. So a very efficient way of imaging the subsurface. This view of the subsurface in itself is useful as a subjective, qualitative way to compare different sites. But what we want to do is see, how can we use these data to actually model in more detail fluid movement, geochemical processes? So we need a way at the field scale to transform resistivity to information about sediment type. And a way we've developed to do this, this is Meredith Goebels, the lead on this, is using cone penetrometer testing. So here's our CPT truck out in the almond grove. And yes, this too fits between the rows of almond trees. And if you acquire data, here's the instrumented cone tip that's pushed down below the ground surface. We were able to reach depths of about 20 to 30 meters. We get information back from our CPT testing, and we had 5 sites. This is all our totem data, plan view of the almond grove. We had 5 CPT sites. And what we're able to do is take this soil behavior type, and we found 5 soil behavior types. We didn't see 2 others of the classifications: clay to silty clay, clay silt to silty clay, silty sand. And we used cluster analysis with the resistivity data to say, we're going to bin these. And we're going to talk about where we have fine grain material and where we have coarse grain material. And then we're going to transform our resistivity model into fraction of coarse grained material. And this is showing the sorts of results we get. Now, this is not just calibrating. Oh, I've got a resistivity here, I've got this there, we actually model the physics of the EM measurement. And so set up this whole system of equations everywhere where we have a resistivity measurement and we know what materials are present. And then we solve to obtain the transform, which looks like this. This tells us if we have this resistivity value, go up here, this is what the coarse grained material, percent of coarse grained material is. Now you'll note this is a distribution. This is because complexity of the real world. So I have a resistivity of 50 ohm meters. I know that the percent coarse grained material is going to range from about 45% to 80%. So what we can do is actually capture that uncertainty. Geophysics is fantastic, but there's definitely uncertainty in the interpretation. We can capture that and work with that in our modeling. Alternatively, we can say, we're going to interpret and display the most probable result. So at the peak of this distribution, if I have resistivity of 50 ohm meters, I'm going to interpret that as 68% coarse grained material. So what we do is, ta-da, this is our final interpreted T10 model over in one of the almond groves. We're looking, this is a slice halfway through the almond grove, so 800 meters long, looking down again about 50 meters to the water table. And this is the final image of where we have coarse grained and fine grained materials in terms of the fraction. So we would interpret sand and gravel being here, clay rich material being here. So looking at this subjectively, great place to put water because we've got this connected pathway down to the water table. Well, instead of scrolling through these 3D displays that we get from our TTEM data, Carissa Pepin has just worked on a methodology where we basically particle tracking. We say, given our model of what's going on in the subsurface, if I put water here, what path does it need to take to reach the water table? And then what we have are these plan view heat maps that say, if we put water in red is good. If we put water here, we've got the closest possible vertical pathway straight to the water table. Blue, we've got the average path length is about 200 meters, which is an interesting look at the tortuosity at the field scale. And I was interested to find that the maximum tortuosity here is actually about 4 or 5, which is a very interesting upscaling the concept of tortuosity. So how accurate is this? Well, we figure out how accurate it is by comparing it to CPT logs. And that's a detailed analysis in the paper shown here. But when we went through that, we ended up saying, well, wait a minute, how accurate does this need to be? And there's a lot of discussion in this paper. It depends what we're going to use this model for. If I want to do detailed analysis and modeling of water quality concerns, then maybe it's really important that I'm really accurate. And maybe I'm going to have 10 CPT data points. So with geophysics, a lot of it comes down to what are you going to do with the interpretation I give you? And that will impact my whole workflow in terms of interpretation and capturing uncertainty. So I'm now going to talk about the airborne EM method. So again, we've got this geophysical technology that can map out what's happening in the subsurface. Now we're imaging down 350 meters. Because the physics is the same, what do we recover? An electrical resistivity model, which again is sensitive to clay content, water content, salinity. But again, we're seeing down to about 350 meters. And because this large transmitter loop lets us see deeper, the compromise is we lose resolution. So our horizontal resolution at best is 40 meters. Our vertical starts at a few meters and degrades to about 50 meters by the time we're down 500 meters. We want to go from this resistivity model to sediment type. How do we do that? Again, we need to find a way to define this transform. And similar to what we did with the CPT data, we use driller's logs. And so we solve a whole system of equations where here I know what's present, I know the resistivity that's measured, here I know what's present, I know the resistivity that's measured, and we solve all these equations and interpret our airborne EM data. Showing the results over the Kauai subbasin. This is the final interpreted section from the airborne EM data there, just submitted to Water Resources Research. And this is being led by Sagi Kang. His photograph is shown here. And by working with well data, we're able to say, here we are along the Sierra foothills. And again, these are all the flight lines. So this is putting together all those 2D models we get everywhere we fly and displaying it as a fence diagram. And here we see the bedrock of the Sierras imaging down about 300 meters. As we move into the valley, thick package of clay-rich sediments, no point recharging along here. As we move out into the valley, we see the blue of the Corcoran clay layer, and we see the sands and gravels of the upper aquifer. We see the lower aquifer shows up green because we don't have the ability to resolve the clay layers and the sand and gravel, so blue and yellow equals green. So green means we have a lot of clay-rich material, but interbedded sands and gravels. So an image like this we can use at this scale to think about where should we be recharging and where should we go in and do a more detailed study? But the final example I need to show you is truly thrilling. The title of this talk was Searching for Recharge Sites. Last December, we flew the Sierra foothills north of the Kauai subbasin, looking for, and I hope Graham's in the audience, Graham and Gary Weissman's incised valley fill deposit. And this is what we found. And Clara's leading this, and she said, yes, I can show it today, even though we haven't yet submitted it. This was a huge collaboration. All the GSAs in the area helped us get flight lines set up, help dealing with the logistics. What we're looking at here is 1,000 kilometers of airborne EM data along the foothills. The purple is the bedrock, but this is the feature that we were all just cheering when we saw it. This is this thick incised valley fill deposit. The red here is the very coarse cobbles and gravel. And we can see that it's connected to this coarse grained unit that just could deliver water far out into the valley. So because I'm the moderator, I'm keeping an eye on time and I think I'm done. This was just to show you all the kind of work we are doing, very, very motivated to take the basic research we're doing at Stanford and thinking, how can we apply that? How can we take that knowledge and put it into action to search for and assess potential recharge sites? And acknowledgement to the funding that's come from a variety of sources. And thanks to Aaron Fukuda, with whom I'm now sharing a TTEM system. He was so interested in this that we got together, and it's the first time Stanford has bought a piece of equipment with anyone. So it took about a year to get through, but we now own a totem system. So thank you, everyone. And it's right on 2:20. So, okay. So I am going to hold questions till the end for me and move on to Helen Dalkey. So Helen is an associate professor in integrated integrated hydrologic sciences in the Department of Land, Air, and Water Resources at the University of California, Davis. Helen's research focus for the past 8 years has been to research the feasibility, benefits, adverse effects, and trade-offs of using agricultural fields as spreading grounds for intentional groundwater recharge. Over to Helen.
Thank you very much, Rosemary. Thank you all for having me. It's a great honor to be here today. And my presentation today will focus on-farm recharge, or AGMAR as it is sometimes called, and I will specifically focus on two major themes. In the first part, I'll focus on decision support tools for growers and practitioners that we have developed based on lab and field and modeling research. And in the second part, I'll mainly focus on water quality. But before I get started, I really would like to spend a moment on acknowledging some of my co-authors, including Nick Murphy, Elad Leventhal, Jonathan Guinaud, and Cristina Prieto Garcia, who have been really instrumental to the advancement of our current understanding of AGMAR, as well as my long-term collaborators, Toby O'Gene and Thomas Harder. So let me see if I can advance. Yes, it's working. Okay. So FLETMAR, as we've seen in this forum, is recognized as an emerging water management strategy that can provide broad benefits for ecosystems and communities in California. AGMAR is a form of FLETMAR where flood flows are spread in the agricultural landscape, such as vineyards, orchards, or fallow fields, to recharge the underlying groundwater aquifer, as shown in these pictures here on the right. Showing some from Terra Nova and the Cosumnes River in these examples. Some of you might not be aware of this, but this year also marks the 10-year anniversary of on-farm recharge at Terra Nova Ranch, where its general manager, Don Cameron, in collaboration with Phil Bashan from Bashan and Associates and Sustainable Conservation, started to flood several acres of vineyards and pistachios in the spring of 2011 with floodwater from the Kings River to recharge groundwater in the hope to counterbalance some of the steadily declining groundwater tables. And so by doing so, Don and Phil not only set an example of sustainable groundwater management, but they also really helped raise awareness among fellow farmers and practitioners about the benefits of MAR to groundwater resources in California. So Don and Phil, thank you for being the pioneers and the trendsetters that you are. So using agricultural landscapes as intentional groundwater recharge areas creates a complex system that requires many biophysical factors to come together to provide a suitable site that is connected to water conveyance so that flood water can be moved fairly quickly underground without creating harm to the agricultural production system. It also represents in many ways an institutional, legal, and economic challenge, since permitting is required to move surface water underground just to recover it later in the season for a variety of beneficial uses. Over the past 10 years, a lot of research has been dedicated to identify MAR locations, specifically by identifying soil types that can infiltrate large amounts of water within relatively short timeframes, as well as crop types that can potentially tolerate waterlogged conditions for short periods of time during the winter season. And so unless we are flooding fallow fields, growers, of course, have concerns about flooding perennial crops in the winter because of the fear that waterlogging will limit root respiration and cause root diseases. Based on literature studies so far, crop tolerance to standing water can be grouped into 5 crop tolerance levels that are shown here, ranging from 0 or no tolerance all the way up to 4, which is indicative of over 2 weeks of tolerance to standing water. However, many of these literature studies to date have focused on worst case scenarios, so crop tolerance on heavy soils that are more prone to develop waterlogged conditions in excess water situations, which are typically not the soils we would be using for AGMAR. So to date, really, there have only been a few replicated studies that have investigated crop tolerance to winter flooding. And those are highlighted here in yellow. So these include studies on alfalfa, almonds, grapes, pecans on different soil types in different climates under different flooding regimes, such as pulsed or continuous flooding. And most of these studies have really confirmed that flooding these crops during the winter or spring month, when we mainly have cooler temperatures, often really does not create a significant decline in yield. But in order to promote really widespread adoption of on-farm recharge, we really cannot wait until we have another 20 or 30 years of crop tolerance studies completed. So my lab developed a little guidance tool to establish or estimate the safe water application duration for different soil textures and crop tolerances. The tool we developed in my lab estimates the safe water application duration for different soil textures, crop tolerances, and root zone depth. And the figure shown here, you can see the typical soil oxygen content and soil moisture dynamics that we observe during a flooding event for recharge. So oxygen content in the soil here is shown as a blue line in the top graph. Water content is shown as the black line in the bottom graph. And the safe water application time is shown as the blue filled area. It is well known that as soon as we start flooding a soil, the applied water acts like a barrier, preventing entry of oxygen into the soil. Root respiration, microbial activity are then slowly consuming the remaining oxygen in the soil until it's more or less all gone, and we have anoxic conditions that can often inhibit root respiration for the crop. A safe water application duration does not only depend on the tolerance of the crop to anoxic conditions, but also on how quickly a soil will drain to allow air to re-enter, which is illustrated here by the inflection point in the soil oxygen curve and the corresponding critical soil water content. So overall, our safe water application duration tool estimates time to saturation using the green and AMP infiltration model. And drainage is simulated with the Sasson solution to the 1D Richards equation, which mainly assumes gravity is the dominant driving force behind drainage. And just to show you how different the drainage properties of soil can be, I'm showing here the drainage curves of two different soil textures, a sand on the left and a sandy clay on the bottom right. The sand typically drains very fast within a few hours, while the heavier sandy clay can take more than 40 days to reach critical water content that allows oxygen to re-enter the soil, as indicated by the dotted horizontal line. By the way, the drainage time of a soil also determines how long it will take until heavy farm machinery might be able to enter a field. So we can use drainage curves to also predict time until trafficability after flooding. The safe water application duration tool currently exists as a spreadsheet model, which can be downloaded from the link shown here at the bottom. Right now, the tool is not very user-friendly. We're aware of that. But if you're curious about it, check it out, download it. And you can see that, for example, here you have a couple options. You can set the dominant soil texture in your profile, ponding depth, certain crop parameters, as well as your rooting depth of your crop. And once all parameters are selected, the model shows a graph of the simulated water content and drainage curve on the right side and provides an estimate of the safe water application time. We are in the process of incorporating and combining this tool with the SAGB index to provide growers with a more comprehensive information system on site suitability. So stay tuned in the coming months for updates on this. Speaking of SAGB, even though many of you already are familiar with it, for those who are not, SAGB stands for Soil Agriculture Groundwater Banking Index, and it is a freely available web tool that provides a composite evaluation of soil suitability to accommodate groundwater recharge while maintaining healthy soils and crops. SAGB is based on 5 major factors that are critical to successful groundwater banking, which include deep percolation, root zone residence time, topography, chemical limitation, and soil surface conditions. that have been derived from digital soil surveys. Soil suitability is expressed through the SAGB score, which is categorized into 6 classes, ranging from excellent in green to very poor in dark red. The web tool is based on a Google Maps platform, so you can easily enter an address and find a location of interest and figure out what the suitability of your soil on your farm might be. Another decision support tool we have recently developed in collaboration with Dr. Scott Devine and Toby Eugene here at UC Davis is the time to trafficability after a soil has been thoroughly wetted due to flooding for groundwater recharge. Trafficability describes the capability of a soil to support traffic from farm machinery without creating wheel slippage or soil compaction. Heavy machinery on wet soils can have major implications for soil, so can cause soil compaction, which diminishes soil porosity, poor connectivity, and then of course impedes soil, water, and air movement that is really necessary for many, many soil services as we know them. Soil compaction is dependent on the soil texture plasticity index, which describes at which water content the soil exhibits plastic properties. So trafficability, therefore, is really limited by excessive moisture, and soils are often not deemed trafficable when the soil water content is within 5 or 10% of field capacity, depending on soil texture. Using the hydrous-vadose hydrology model, Scott Devine simulated drainage and evaporation from over 2,900 soil profiles to estimate the median days until trafficability. For fine textured soils such as clays and silts, he assumed machinery can enter when the water content reaches 85% of field capacity. For coarse textured soils, he assumed a water content threshold of 95% of field capacity. The 2 maps you can see here on the right show the median days of trafficability for the month January and February. As you can see, it can take between 10 and 25 days for some of the soils, particularly in the Sacramento Valley, to dry up sufficiently for heavy machinery to enter. Again, this tool, just as the Safe Water Application Duration tool, will be combined and made public through the SAGB index in the coming month. So next, I'd like to turn to concerns around AgMAR negatively impacting groundwater quality. With a few exceptions, such as alfalfa, which is a nitrogen-fixing plant, most crops grown on agricultural fields need nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium fertilizer, and water for plant growth to really achieve maximum yields. The Central Valley has been farmed for decades, and repeated fertilizer applications and irrigation events have resulted in a buildup of excess nitrate in the root zone and the unsaturated zone above the water table. So slow transport of nitrate from the unsaturated zone is a process that is constantly occurring, particularly under winter recharge, natural recharge, and irrigation events. Nitrate concentrations in groundwater have exceeded the maximum contaminant level of 10 milligrams per liter in some parts of the Central Valley. And if that groundwater were consumed as drinking water, it would definitely pose a threat to human health, especially to infants and pregnant women. And we therefore wanted to take a closer look and assess whether AgMAR represents a risk to nitrate contamination of groundwater. The perceived risk of increased contamination of groundwater with nitrate is mainly based on the fact that as we flood farm fields in the winter for groundwater recharge, the infiltrating water will transport residual nitrate from the vadose zone to the groundwater table. Through field experiments, we have observed that in soils with relatively high infiltration rates, between 50 and 90% of the residual nitrate stored in the root zone will be flushed in the first flooding event. If recharge is conducted using pulsed flooding events, which are more or less just large irrigation events, the oxy conditions that prevail in the root zone often combined with elevated moisture from the recharge, will stimulate mineralization of organic nitrogen from organic matter to ammonium, nitrate, and then eventually nitrite and eventually nitrate, which can again accumulate in the soil until the crop is planted and will take it up, or it could be flushed with the next recharge event. If a site is flooded continuously for several days, there is a high chance that denitrification occurs, which is the process where under largely anoxic conditions, nitrate is converted to nitrous gases such as nitrous oxide or denitrogen. So denitrification is more important in finer textured soils that reach anoxic conditions typically quicker, and for removing nitrate from the source water used for recharge, such as if we use stormwater runoff from urban areas or coastal farm fields like the Tahoe Valley, which often has higher nitrate concentrations in the water that is being recharged. So to illustrate some of these dynamics, I'm going to show you some of our field data that we've collected at one of our replicated winter recharge trials at the Kearney Research and Extension Center. Here we flooded 2 Thompson seedless grape vineyards for 2 and 4 weeks respectively in each the February of 2020 and 2021. So in this figure here on the right, you can see the ponding level of water in the flood treatment in the top graph, soil moisture content at 3 different depths in the second graph, oxygen content in the root zone in the third graph, and the oxidation reduction or short redox potential in the bottom graph. This vineyard was flooded continuously for 4 weeks and was slow to infiltrate. We had an infiltration rate of about 0.1 meter per day. The slow infiltration rate combined with microbial respiration lowered oxygen levels in the root zone quite quickly to near zero values within about a day or 2. On the left side here, you can see the dissolved organic carbon, nitrate, and ammonium observed in the pore water, again, collected from the 4-week flooded vineyard. And again, we see here during the first week of flooding, as we transition from oxic to anoxic conditions, we see a clear decrease in soil nitrate and ammonium to almost zero in the root zone, which could be due to leaching or is mainly due to leaching, and a little bit due to denitrification. What is also important to know about this experiment is that we flooded this vineyard with pumped groundwater, not surface water, which contained about 2 to 3 milligrams of nitrate. So in this nitrate was completely denitrified in the first 20 centimeters of the soil. We couldn't really detect it at greater depth. And another thing to point out, at the end of the experiment, when flooding was stopped, it took about 2 to 3 weeks for the root zone to re-aerate, and for redox conditions to recover to non-reducing levels. And as oxygen levels recovered in the soil, we saw clearly an onset of mineralization of organic nitrogen again to nitrate that slowly increased nitrate levels in the soil. This slide here shows the estimated amount of nitrate we leached in both vineyards, so the 2 and the 4-week flooded vineyards. Blue dots show estimates for the 4-week flooded vineyard, and the red dots show the values for the 2-week flooded vineyard. The left plot shows daily rates, and the right plot shows cumulative values over the duration of the experiment. Again, we can see here clearly that most nitrate is leached early on in the first couple days after flooding has started, and then amounts level off as the root zone is flushed and less nitrate is available for transport. The difference in curves that you can see here, so in the magnitude, is also a reflection of how much soil nitrate is initially available for transport, and we had more nitrate in the soil matrix in the 4-week flooded vineyard, which you can see here by the higher values. We also looked at potential effects of AgMAR on greenhouse gas emissions, such as carbon dioxide and nitrous oxide, which you can see here plotted on the right for the 2-week flooded vineyard shown in green and the 4-week flooded vineyard shown in blue lines. One would expect, of course, that we would observe an increased nitrous oxide flux during the flooding as a result of denitrification of nitrate. However, to our surprise, we did not observe elevated greenhouse gas emissions in the vineyard that was flooded for 2 weeks, but we did see an increase in nitrous oxide emissions in the 4-week flooded vineyard after we stopped applying the water, which again could be denitrification of nitrate that was just freshly mineralized from the organic matter pool. Greenhouse gas emissions were clearly elevated following fertilization events, such as the one that occurred at the end of April in 2020. So results are definitely encouraging with respect to climate change concerns.
Hey, Helen, can you wrap up in the next minute? I'm protecting our question period.
Yes, 1 second, yeah. Using the collected field data, my student Nick recently built a very sophisticated reactive nitrate leaching transport model by coupling hydrous with the Freaksy geochemical modeling code. And this really allowed us to explore various best management practices. We used data from 2 sites, from 2 almond orchards. One was a sand, the other one was a fine sandy loam. They both had very different residual nitrate loads, but what I would like to show you here is these plots here, which show plotted flooding frequency, or the interval between water applications, and flooding magnitude, which is the amount of water applied per recharge event, and then their effect on bulk nitrate recharge concentrations. And so what you can see here is the highest nitrate leaching potential exists at low flooding amounts and low flooding frequencies. But we also see quite different trends. In the sand, for example, we see an increase in bulk recharge concentration as we increase the interval between flooding events, and that is because the soil has more time to mineralize more nitrate. The other fine sandy soil, which often stays wetter, more anoxic, for longer periods of time, we see actually the opposite trend. So as you're increasing the time between water applications, you are actually allowing more denitrification to happen, which reduces the amount of nitrate available for leaching. Let me finish with 2 remarks, which I would highlight. Because mineralization is a process that creates more nitrate in the soil, particularly following recharge events, I would like to advocate for adding a checkbox to the questionnaire that is used in the Irrigated Lands Regulatory Program, so that these dynamics and processes can be better accounted for in nitrogen management plans. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Helen. That was fascinating. So thanks for that. I encourage people to put their questions in the chat, and we will come back to them at the end of this session. So thank you. Over to Michael. So screen share your presentation. Michael Founds. Michael specializes in multi-benefit ecological restoration, modeling groundwater, surface water interaction, and quantifying impacts of climate and wildlife on flow regimes. At CBEC, Michael manages projects that involve synthesizing complex data and modeling results into metrics that can be meaningfully communicated, I'm all for that, to stakeholders to inform restoration design.
I'm trying to find a way to.
Whoops. Michael currently leads research initiatives focusing on climate change, post-fire watershed hydrology, and managed aquifer recharge on floodplains. Over to Michael.
All right, thanks for that introduction, and thanks for the great talk, Helen. So we're going to switch gears a little bit. A lot of the previous focus of the talks have been on Agmar and how can we use existing conveyance systems of agricultural fields to promote recharge. We're now going to look at floodplain restoration and how can we potentially connect areas of disconnected floodplains to potentially have more recharge, and also what kind of potential habitat benefits can we get from that. I want to acknowledge the whole team that I'm working with. I'm presenting this information, but we have a great group at CBEC. There's myself, Chris Bowles, and Luke Tillman doing a lot of the technical work on this project. And then we are collaborating with Jacobs through our work on the Central Valley Flood Protection Plan, with Jeremy Thomas and Tapash Das. Also at DWR, I'm sure most people know Jenny, but we are also working with David Martesian and Lori Kamarochu, and they've all been great on this project. Okay, so why are we doing this project? There's been a lot of talk in this conference about the scale of restoration needed, or the scale that we need to implement flood or different types of recharge. And one of the things that we need to kind of think about when we're thinking about scaling these projects is how can we track progress towards an objective? How can we identify all the potential opportunities and start implementing projects? So this tool is a way that we can first kind of identify the physical opportunities, specifically for floodplain recharge and increasing cell-mounted habitat suitability. And we're trying to do this in the way that we can evaluate them for both existing conditions, but also for things like a future management scenario or a future climate scenario. And this builds off a lot of the work that was done through the 2012 Central Valley Flood Protection Plan, which established the Floodplain Restoration Opportunities Analysis, known as FROA. And we are building off that work and taking it from a single event-based model that can be done at the Central Valley scale to something where we can look at the full water year potential for recharge and habitat suitability. And we're going to apply this pilot study on the upper reach of the San Joaquin River. And this is an area where we see a lot of major potential climate impacts, huge increases in peak flows. So there's going to be a lot of projects needed for flood risk reduction, and also a lot of opportunities for things like groundwater recharge or increased floodplain activation for cell-mounted species. So I'm going to first give kind of the background of the SPRO analysis, what we are planning to do with this tool, and then we'll give a quick overview of the pilot study hydrology, the topography, how that affects our physical opportunities for restoration. And then we'll get into some of the floodplain inundation results, and then last, how we are modeling recharge. So the 2012 FROA was a GIS-based analysis that looked at HEC-RAS output, so a hydraulic model output, to project the water surface elevation outwards, to look outside of leveed reaches of the Central Valley rivers and say, where are the potential opportunities for restoration? And this tool was focused only on inundation. So where can we potentially have water out on the floodplain by either setting back a levee or through topographic modification? And it looked at a 2-mile wide corridor beyond the levees. And then it looked at specific thresholds for inundation. So a 7-day duration flow that has a recurrence interval every 2 and 3 years. What we are doing is we are taking the FIP, which is the first screening step in FROA, which includes kind of other processes down the line where they look at land use, conservation areas, and major infrastructure. The FIP analysis is only looking at the physical opportunities, and we have the term EcoFIP, which is ecological floodplain inundation potential. And we are adding on the capability to look at cell-mounted habitat suitability and floodplain recharge. A lot of the talks have looked at the kind of different scales that we can evaluate and different components of flood-MAR. And keeping with that kind of theme, this pilot study is evaluating 3 increasingly complex tiers of analysis. The first tier is a simple replication of the original inundation analysis. So that just kind of shows us for a study area, which areas could potentially inundate. In the second tier, we are adding on the habitat suitability analyses. These are combinations of depth and velocity that are suitable for rearing cell-mounted. We are also accumulating acre day statistics. What that means is instead of looking at a single event, we are looking at across a full water year, or 30 water years in our case, and saying how many acre days of inundation would you have for a particular extent. So you can do this at the reach scale across 50 miles of the San Joaquin River, or you could do this for thousands of parcels, or for a particular project extent and say, you know, what would my acre days of inundation look like for the water year, and what would my habitat suitability look like for the water year? And this is really important when we're thinking about future operation scenarios or climate change, because the current flow regime is expected to change, and we should plan to operate it in a slightly different way. And this tool can help us evaluate those benefits for habitat suitability and recharge. The other component is recharge. And The kind of hydraulic spatial analysis allows us kind of the spatial extent of floodplain inundation that could potentially be achieved. And then we have the question of how does this water that gets out on the floodplain move through the vadose zone? And this is, a lot of us are working on that question. It would be great to have some of Rosemary's work for some areas. Unfortunately, that level of data isn't available everywhere. So how can we use the existing data sets to try and predict flux through the vadose zone? And we're going to do that through numerical modeling through representative soil profiles. And this is a throwback to the Merced study where they have their diagram of how all the models connect together. We have that too, but at the very simple level, we are taking surface hydraulic modeling results, combining that with some numerical vadose zone modeling, and then we are integrating that into each tier of analysis. So for our tier 1, it is the simple event-based inundation. For tier 2 and 3, we are looking at more complex acre day statistics over the water year. Our study reaches from the Friant Dam down to the Chowchilla bifurcation. The reach designations were defined by the San Joaquin Restoration Program. And this is a really interesting reach of river because it is going through a very large shift in management. So a settlement was won in 2006 that basically required environmental flows to be released to support salmonid populations. And so starting with water year 2009, they have started releasing more flows during the spring, and they plan to increase that in the future. And this kind of shows the importance of having a tool that you can evaluate both existing conditions or a kind of altered flow regime. And kind of speaking to this kind of downstream of a reservoir, as many major Central Valley streams are, is this is really going to impact the duration of flows or elevated flows that we have to potentially work with. So the 400 CFS is kind of the more frequently occurring flow. On the x-axis there, we can see the number of days that the discharge is exceeded. So we commonly get around 400 CFS, and then for 30 to 50 days during the year, we'll get up above 1,000 CFS, and then we rarely get into these kind of flows around 5,000 CFS where you really actually get floodplain activation during existing conditions. So one of the first steps in our analysis is a height above river analysis. And what this is doing is it looks at the water surface elevation for a specific flow. In this case, we're using 1,000 CFS because this is a commonly occurring flow during the spring season that they release as a restoration target. And we're comparing the water surface elevation from that flow to the surrounding topography. So we're projecting that outwards. So the purple and blue areas are below the water surface elevation. So they would be inundated if they are connected in this locations. And then we have the green and yellow areas, which are slightly elevated above the water, the river. Then when we get to the red and black areas, those areas are quite disconnected, and it would take really substantial changes to reconnect those areas of floodplain. And we can see in the kind of upper reaches of the river, there's a lot of kind of gravel pits and things that are currently disconnected. And then when we get into the lower reaches, we're now looking at just the inundation for connected and disconnected areas. There is a large area where there is an existing levee that is preventing connection to the surrounding floodplain. So some of our modeling results just look at kind of the connection for current conditions. So that's the blue, and then these green areas are currently disconnected either by a barrier, most of the time just the topography, or a levee in that kind of lower reach where it says 2A by Gravelly Ford to the Chowchilla bifurcation. One of the interesting things we're looking at is how we could potentially modify the topography of the floodplain to increase the connectivity and inundation. In this figure, we are showing a map where we allow potential grading of up to 10 feet to achieve the target of 1 foot below the 1,000 CFS water surface elevation. And in reality, you wouldn't grade the whole river down to a parking lot, but it kind of starts to illustrate some of the areas that you could potentially reconnect by types of topographic modification that we frequently apply on many river systems. So typical restoration projects involve levee setbacks or topographic modification. And this is a quick way to identify some of those opportunities at a large scale. And also with the surface that we create from this, we can look at what the potential conditions would look like if we were to modify the topography in this way. This is kind of zooming in, and at the kind of upper reaches, there's a lot of potential side channel habitat. And when we get to the lower reaches, there's a whole area that is kind of behind a levee that you could potentially modify to achieve inundation during a large portion of the year. So for our tier 1 analysis, we are simply looking at specific flows that are ecologically significant. So we can look at whether those flows are connected or disconnected at a certain range, and we would potentially be looking at opportunities in the areas that are currently disconnected of these flows. Tier 2 is where we take a particular location. So in this place, that site A is a polygon extent that's in this kind of lower area of the floodplain near the border. And we say, what would the inundation characteristics look like if you were to set back this levee, if it were connected to the river system? And we can summarize that over a 30-year period of water year to get an idea of the kind of inundation characteristics. And we can also look at salmonid habitat suitability. It's a flood conference. I haven't focused on kind of the way we calculate this, but a lot of the project is comparing different tiers of analysis for salmonid habitat suitability. And we can do this for the existing conditions and for any kind of altered scenario. In this case, we had a modified topography, but we kept the threshold very small. So this site was not changed very much. And then tier 3 is going to be the focus of a future analysis, where we use both a spatial temporal analysis of habitat suitability, and we use a modified habitat quantification tool. It's similar to what was developed by SFEI and Allison Whipple. So how do we integrate all these tiers of analysis with recharge? So the first tier, we are going to map inundation results within a specific area. And then we're also going to model what the recharge would be for that type of particular event. In tier 2, we're trying to summarize up those types of recharge events over the water year. In tier 3, we will apply a much smaller area and actually use the kind of hydraulic modeling as boundary conditions for our VSO model. So here's a couple of the challenges, as I'm sure a lot of people are familiar with, for modeling recharge in the Vados zone. So right now we're evaluating a scenario that doesn't exist in reality. We're evaluating a potential project if you were to modify the topography or set back a levee. So you can't just directly go and observe it. The timescale to evaluate floodplain inundation events is very different than what is typically evaluated in a larger groundwater model. So we're evaluating, 1 day or 7 days of floodplain inundation, whereas these groundwater models operate on a slightly different timescale. And then there is this representation of the soil profile, what Rosemary is working on, and Helen. And it's difficult to do this, especially at the surface where it's very sensitive to recharge. In this study, we're going to focus on just the top 10 meters of soil and say, what can we do to represent reasonable soil profiles and to feed into our Vados zone model. So what data do we have available to come up with these soil profiles that we can potentially represent? At the surface, the most spatially extensive data we have is the soil survey data. And this has layer by layer information of the soil textures, which can be converted through pedotransfer functions to represent hydraulic soil properties. And it's imperfect, but it is very spatially extensive. So we definitely want to take advantage of this. And the soil survey data has been translated into different categories that integrate with depth. So the hydrologic soil group is a very common one of these that are used in a lot of hydrologic models. And we've done some analysis looking at different layers that are derived from the soil survey data. We found that the hydrologic soil groups was good at representing the physical properties, specifically representing the saturated connectivity. And that's what it is kind of specifically designed to do. And that tracked very well with what we saw in the driller's logs. So we did some analysis looking at both the surface layer and a lot of the drillers logs across the Central Valley and the hydrologic soil groups, and found some good relationships between when the hydrologic soil groups specified that it was a type A soil correlating to a sand, and conversely, type D soil correlating to clays. So what we are intending to do is basically for each of these hydrologic soil groups, come up with a representative soil profile. And at the surface, we're going to just use the soil survey data. So the texture of the soil with each category. So this is our soil profile. We'll represent silt loam for the top layer. And then down through kind of the top meter and a half of soil that they can represent. And when we get below that top meter to meter and a half of soil represented by the soil survey, we're going to use the physical properties described by the hydrologic soil groups and seen in the driller's logs. And there's a lot more information to go there, but this is a pretty quick presentation, so I will skip some of the details there. I have some quick examples of what this might look like in a physical model. Really, we'll run this as more of a 1D simulation, but it's useful to have these kind of scenarios to look at how water moves through the Vado zone in a realistic floodplain inundation scenario. So at the top, we have water content, and at the bottom, we have pressure head. And we can see how water moves during this floodplain inundation event where it hits this restrictive layer and then kind of slowly moves into the Vado zone. And what we can do with these models is we can actually look at the velocity of water moving through the floodplain. And what we really want to evaluate is at that kind of 10-meter depth of soil, which we are using kind of because it coincides with groundwater dependent ecosystems, is how do we get water past the root zone and how fast is water moving at depth? We're not trying to decide the fate or figure out the fate of the water when it gets deeper. That was something that can hopefully be resolved in some of the other groundwater modeling, some of which Helen was alluding to, and her students are doing some really cool research on. But we can use these type of models to come up with really interesting, a really good understanding of what's happening in the subsurface during a realistic floodplain inundation event, and kind of use that to inform where we decide where to put our restoration projects. So for our tier 1 analysis, we're simply mapping our representative soil profiles to the landscape for the particular floodplain inundation event. For tier 2, we're trying to summarize up that information to the water year scale. And then for tier 3, we're going to do a more kind of sophisticated analysis where we put the boundary condition of the floodplain inundation into the Vado zone model. And with that, I think I guess we probably don't have time for questions, but I highly recommend that anyone who has questions, please reach out to me. I will drop my email in the chat, or my coworker Luke Tillman with any really technical questions. And if you have any kind of larger scale questions about where this is all going, please feel free to contact Jenny or David or Lori at DWR. Thank you all so much for your time, and I'm looking forward to the rest of the presentations.
Great. Thank you very much, Michael. And again, I sent a message out to everyone to please put your questions in the chat. Some people can respond, but we can use these questions during the question period to frame more of a discussion. So questions for Michael, put them in the chat and we can pick them up during the Q&A. So now we have a 5-minute stretch break. We are close to on time, so I'm not going to cut into our 5-minute. And during this break, Tommy is putting up a poll. So yeah, 5-minute poll. So anyways, I have no idea where the poll is, but it will be here. But everyone take your 5 minutes. There it is. Okay. So how can pilot and research work be scaled up and applied to on the ground research projects? And there's the link. And I think that's going to also be pasted into the chat. So during your break, give some thoughts to that question. Enjoy your break. Thanks, Michael, Helen. Great. Lots of interesting work going on. Oh, and is that the break minute counter? Yes.
And if you're not taking a break, we're open to questions. Or comments.
Helen, if you're still available. I saw that in our chat discussion here. I just wanted to follow up on your comments on the timing of. So it's the duration. It's not the duration of the anoxic conditions. It's the mineralization occurring following the anoxic conditions that's determining the nitrate leaching. And if the anoxic conditions are minimized, because I'm assuming that's saturation, full saturation. So I wanted to compare it to the Floodmar-Merced study where we were using a 75% saturation level, wondering if that would be a safer level for avoiding the mineralization process.
Yeah, so that is a tricky one because the oxygen depletion is not just a function of soil texture, it's also a function of temperature and the respiration rates, whichever you have, plant root respiration or microbial respiration. So we often use a soil water content threshold as a proxy for when we think a soil is depleted in oxygen. But there is no one number that will be correct for that assumption. So, but in general, what we've seen is like you reach saturation in the soil and then it still might take a couple hours or days until you actually reach anoxic conditions. In that time, mineralization can happen. Once you reach anoxic conditions, you're going to switch to predominantly denitrification.
Yeah.
If there is nitrate to denitrify, and that seems to be the issue at our sites. We don't have nitrate at that time to denitrify, or not that much left, because most of it has already been leached at that point.
How about if it's further down the vadose zone? That's the other question I've seen is how much denitrification can occur when it's down, past the 10-meter zone or.
Yeah, that would be great if we had one of those Chinese research facilities where they dig you an observation pit of like 50-meter depth. And you can just do pore and soil sampling all the way down to 50-meter depth. Yeah, that's really the tricky part. So in general, microbial abundance, so just like how many microbes you have, is decreasing with depth. And typically below 1.5 meters, it's maybe, less than 10% of what we see in the near surface. And microbial abundance does control rates, of any nitrogen cycling processes. So this is why, in general, the assumption is that there is very little, biogeochemical activity at greater depth. But Hannah Waterhouse's data suggests there might be some. We don't quite know yet.
Lots of potential discussion here. Love to see other people's discussion on this.
Ellen, something you might look for is when recharge occurs, the bicarbonate concentration shoots up pretty rapidly, usually. So you're essentially stripping CO2 out of the soil where the CO2 concentration is very high. But to my knowledge, well, there's one paper from China on this, but few have looked into the CO2 sequestration benefits of recharge.
Beep, 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 beep.
Okay.
We can finish later that
Okay,
discussion. Graham, thanks.
Okay, I'm determined to keep us on schedule here and preserve our question discussion period at the end. Sorry, Graham. That was rude, but anyways.
No problem.
So we're on to Phil Bichond, who Philip Bichond has a PhD in environmental engineering from UC Berkeley and has worked at the nexus of environmental, water, and agricultural systems for 30 years. He led the first on-farm recharge study in 2011 at Terra Nova Ranch. Yes, as Helen described him, pioneer, trendsetter, and has been involved in the science, engineering, and implementation of on-farm recharge in the Central Valley and in coastal areas since then. So over to you, Phil. You are muted. So for some reason,
That might be, okay.
Yeah, I'm unmuted now, right? Hi, can you hear me?
yes.
Go ahead, Phil.
Okay, great. Yeah, so thanks, Rosemary, for the introduction. So I was going to talk today about two San Joaquin Valley examples of on-farm recharge projects that I've been involved with. I'm going to touch, it covers both some of the science and engineering behind it, as well as some of the social issues associated with it. So the first study I'm going to talk about is work that we did with UC Cooperative Extension and Pacific Gold Agriculture, as well as some support from UC Davis, Helen Dawkins' lab, who helped with some of the data analyses and also did some paired studies at the site. So this is a picture of my wife Sandra, who led this study, and Ben King of Pacific Ag at their orchard up in Colusa, at his orchard up at Colusa. And we have a white paper that we have off of this that is that covers various things. The provides an overview of the study, talks about the recharge rates we achieved, talks about oxygen levels in soil water and their management, talks about cost. We did a cost study. We have a grower interest poll in there. We have some conceptual models on moisture and oxygen transport, and then management opportunities. And this, in short, this is the site that we're at is about 25 acres or 30 acres total. And we had it planted all in pecans. Most of them were about 40-year-old trees. We had 4 water treatments, as you can see: continuous, non-continuous, over irrigation, and a control, which was just irrigation. And then we had various soil and pore water monitoring, some surface water monitoring, and then some other measurements that were going on out there as well: plant health indicators, flow monitoring, cost, cultural practice tracking, things like that. One of the things that we were really trying to do at this study was demonstrate the high, what kind of high rates you could get in reality, and feasibly at a site. And so we implemented some of these terracing methods to try to spread water more evenly across the field. And one of the big issues when you're talking about, working like this in orchards is how do you do that cost effectively and effectively. And so we looked at using both sill fences and using polypipe, but using it as a dam instead of for distributing water. And we were able to get very high rates of recharge and out of this approach, which was going to increase your efficiencies of implementing it, reduce your cost per acre and per acre feet of volume recharge, and also help with dilution of leachates to groundwater. The recharge rates we saw, the first year we didn't have, we only had the terracing in place for a couple of weeks. We were able to recharge about 11 feet of water under continuous OFR, on the continuous OFR treatment, and about 6 feet in the alternating treatment. In the second year, we had some problems defining the area of the plot because there was some leakage out of the plot, but we fell somewhere in the range of 26 to 40 feet of water recharged on the same site as we had in year 1. So we saw about a 250, minimum of a 250% in the second year as compared to the first year. And here's your person over here, your 6 foot tall person. About American height, but not American build. They're not chubby enough. But anyway, they're it's a lot of water compared to your regular person who's just standing there. And this is in comparison to like over irrigation, in which we had about a half a foot per during those periods of time. We also looked at cost, and we did a pretty extensive cost study of OFR. We looked at what was going on at Ben King's place, as well as we looked at what it would, compared it to cultural practices with other pecan folks that were who had volunteered to provide us with cost information on their crops. We did a survey at the beginning to see who would provide information. And the annual cost was about, for growing pecans, is about $2,300 an acre. For conducting OFR, it was between $35 and $200 an acre. And that included irrigation labor costs, putting in small berms, turnout connections, and addressing water delivery issues. The cost decreased with time, with longer OFR applications. So, you see a sharp decrease as you extend for longer periods of time. And it also decreased when you improve water distribution. So our terracing decreased. So, this $200 number is a relatively short-term application of recharge waters without terracing, and the $35 is closer to when you've been terracing and you've been running it for 6 or 8 weeks. We recharged on these orchards for about 6 to 7 weeks each year, and it was in the spring. So I think I just went to the end of the slide. Okay, I'm back. I told Helen I was going to stumble through this presentation. So now I've met that objective. So we also looked at tree health because of, we had monitored oxygen in these soils, and we saw that we were in both the continuous and intermittent flooded non-continuous OFR fields. We saw that we were dropping oxygen levels in the pore space, partial pressure levels. So we looked at effects on the pecans. Pecans are a facultative, upland facultative species. So they can deal with both flooded and wetland and upland conditions, preferring upland conditions, but able to withstand wetland conditions. And so, we looked at visual assessment of bronzing. We looked at leaf analysis, minerals levels in that. We looked at stem water potential, and we looked at yield. And in none of these metrics did we see any real sign that the trees under recharge were being affected by the on-farm recharge treatment. We did a nut grower poll, and we found that, of those who responded, about 60% were very interested in conducting OFR, but they weren't sure if they would do it on pecans, because a lot of these people were growers of other nut crops. This was very interesting. 2/3 of those responding were more interested about longer term considerations than shorter term considerations. So they were more concerned about tree health and groundwater quality than they were about this year's costs and yields. And they were also very interested in working with GSAs and irrigation districts, especially in the area of trying to develop water credits and groundwater storage. So we have some products from this project. We have the cost study, we have the white paper, we have a crop compatibility calendar based on our growers' practices for growing pecans. And then we also had some outreach. We have an article in Pecan South. We had our article in West Coast Nut. And then we have a webinar that we gave that's hosted on the MEGSA, McMullen Area GSA website. So that's that study. This is the second one I'm going to talk about. This is more of a longer term project. This is the McMullen Area GSA Terra Nova project that I started with Don Cameron and a few others back in 2011. At that time, Will Horwath at UC Davis and Sudroy Roy at Tetra Tech and Joe Choprainer at Susquehanna were all part of that team. And this project was started to basically look at capturing intermittent flood flows that were hitting the area and seemed like good sources of extra water in dealing with chronic and severe overdraft. This is all predates Sigma. And phase one, so we did the CIG study. It was very positive results. We moved into expanding it. Phase one was the first expansion. It's about 5,000 acre expansion. You can see the various infrastructure. We have canals. We have a turnout that we had put into the onto the James River. We have a crossing over McMullen Grade, which is a highway down there. And then we had a north and eastern extension with some plans for future expansion. And there's a lot of steps to getting this thing in place. There was the CEQA, there was permitting for the main conveyance system, there was putting in the infrastructure, there was operational and partnering agreements that we developed. We also had on-farm conveyance infrastructure that we worked on, easements that we needed to purchase for flood and for conveyance. And the most recent thing that we've done is work on a flood flow capture plan for a recharge, for planning recharge on this property. These are some of the things that were built, finished in 2019, the canal, the turnout here in 2018 when it's framed, in 2019 after it's nearly finished. And then we moved into the expansion. This project was always expected to expand, hoped to expand. It was planned to have a north expansion and east expansion with the onset of Sigma and areas of efforts within the McMullen area GSA to develop an arterial system and start looking at developing a water bank to fill up their depleted aquifer. This is now expanded, is going to expand quite far eastward under the on-farm recharge and floodmar projects that we have. So we have funding from the NRCS, we have funding from the State Water Board as well, and that's on top of the DWR funding we have for phase one. We have very similar stuff that we're doing on this project, except on this one we're going to have to do NEPA as well. Same types of things, permitting, infrastructure, agreements, easements. And when we're done, this phase one in expansion will have a total capacity to capture 25,000 acre feet per month when flood flows and surface waters are available for recharge. We have a flood flow capture plan that we're developing. It's under final review right now. Internally, there's a lot of decision support tools out there, but we tried to make this really a field by field level analysis. And so we look at each field and we looked at the topography, the crop histories, the nitrate loading based on those crop histories, farm infrastructure, availability to those locations. We looked at, we estimate their potential on-farm recharge rates and volumes from all those factors together, both the physics of it and the availability of water. We did a statistical lithographic assessment of the area to make sure that to make sure we weren't having any problems in any area as far as getting the water to groundwater. SESCON put together some crop calendars earlier. We've taken those crop calendars and massaged them a bit for this project. And then we've developed on-farm recharge practices that we're folding into these NRCS conservation practices that are out there. Some of this is following sort of the art of on-farm recharge. Jeannie Darby at UC Davis, about, 18 years ago now or so, 15 years ago now, and I was having a discussion in her office, and she said, engineering is an art and not a science. And I think to some extent this work is too. There's a science is progressing quite rapidly, as you can see from the work from Helen and others that have been presented and the tools that have come out of it. But it may not, but Sigma is going faster. And so, we have some themes on these recommendations that we putting together in our farm flow capture plan, basically to try to do practices that are minimizing effects of groundwater quality, do practices that will maximize your recharge rate so you can maximize your return on your investment, your recharge and your dilution, and that includes, things like fertilizer and pesticide avoidance. And then do a lot of monitoring of that you can to validate what you're doing, advance the science and support SGMA compliance. Lots of work to be done here. There's some challenges I wanted to talk about. I wanted to talk a little bit on each one of these: regional uncertainties, SGMA structural issues, institutional silos, and conflict of interest. These are things that we've made a lot of progress there, but we face challenges every day, and it seems like new ones every day as we try to push this forward. And it's really a lessons on advancing projects of scale and value, from this effort. So, regional uncertainties, these affect the people's decisions on what they are willing to do and what risks they're willing to take. And these uncertainties are all regional. They're climate change and reservoir operation rules and status and future status of conveyance systems and water rights, what might happen, addressing environmental and ecological needs like minimum flows, and then abilities to do trades and transfers, between regions and things like that. Those uncertainties make it create a big error bar about what around what you say you think they can do and what they might be able to do with recharge. So that all affects that's a big decision challenge. SGMA structural issues are an issue for moving forward, and there's just SGMA is a great law, and it has really pushed this the groundwater and water resources questions and problems to the fore. But there are some issues, and one of it is that it's compliance. Well, the good thing about it is compliance is based upon compliance across the designated subbasin. So, the subbasin doesn't succeed. No one succeeds in the subbasin unless the subbasin succeeds, but it allows many GSAs per subbasin. So, it's hard to avoid dysfunction. It's like a family. I've come from a large family of 7, and getting everyone to agree on anything was impossible. So you have several GSAs with potentially several GSPs. Each one can potentially have their own GSP. They have member agency in their boards. Every one of these has several people on their boards. Each agency has its own mission, and each GSA may see different paths to SGMA compliance. So, do the numbers. It's like 35 or 40 people trying to make a decision in the room. And it's really, really hard to get good decisions. There's institutional silos as well. And this is a little, everyone talks about silos and collaboration. Fundamentally though, when you sort of do the math, where you're silos are superposition and collaborations are multivariate. Under collaboration, the whole is greater than the sum. But the silos, you have local and regional agencies, different state agencies, and within state agencies, and each one of these agencies or sub-agencies has its own mission and legal commitments. So the question on these collaboration efforts is, at what point does the larger pie benefit you? What risk are you willing to take? Can you meet your legal commitments? And can the benefits be monetized by its members? Those are tough questions for people. And they need to decide, whether they should close the walls of their silo and protect their silos so they meet their legal commitments, or whether collaboration has the benefit that's going to make the pie big enough that they're going to benefit. And then how do they do that within the legal confines of their institution? That's the last one I'm going to talk about is conflicts of interest. People are doing science and stuff. They're probably thinking, I'm doing the science and whatever, and I'm getting good answers, and it's great. And why don't people just listen? and these are reasons people just don't listen. So conflicts of interest, and these are two real big problems in the San Joaquin and in much of the Central Valley. Same law firms represent multiple agencies and GSAs within a region, and maybe within a sub-basin, often within a sub-basin. And the same can be said for engineering firms. And so, how does the consultant or advisor provide non-biased recommendations when they're representing clients who have missions that don't completely align? And maybe they're worse than that. Maybe the missions are are like an opposite. How do you how do you give non-biased recommendations under those conditions? Now, it's nothing to say about if these people are good or bad people. They're all people, most of them are trying to do a good job. But this is just like the sun rising and setting. How do you do it? It's a tough thing. And then for those who receive the information and recommendations, can it be trusted? Can you trust what you're hearing because of that conflict of interest? And then how do you make the informed decisions when you do not know if you should accept the recommendations or not? And then what happens if we are no longer friends? I mean, that's a big question too. 10 years ago, there was a friend group in the McMullen area GSA group. And now this year, the friend group is different. And what about those friends that we no longer have? And how does that affect where we can go? And so these are all really big issues. And so a lot of work, lots of work done, lots to do. And, for this project, we're trying to develop robust, defensible data collection programs. We're trying to do support research and associated partnerships to advance, the programs and projects. We're really trying to develop a strong outreach program to educate and inform landowners, because the landowners are the ultimate people making the decisions down there, because they vote in and out people into these boards. We're making steps towards regional collaboration with cooperation to coordination to collaboration. Most of the time right now, we're just sort of hanging around cooperation, but we hope to get to full collaboration at some point. We're trying to make it into a multi-use project to reduce potential, to increase its potential benefits and reduce its the potential risk. If your recharge project doesn't turn out to be recharging as much as you thought it could, but it offers other potential benefits, then you still come out ahead, and vice versa. We're looking at structural and non-structural infrastructure, so that includes management practices. And we're trying to advance the science and art of on-farm recharge and flood mar. And there's a funny.
And with that.
No, you're gonna listen to Paul McCartney, Fresh Air, November 2021, talked about his bus going off the road on the way to a concert. They were stuck on the side of the road, down off the road. And they said, well, what are you going to do? And one of them said, well, something will happen.
A great note to end on. Thanks very much, Bill, for that. That was fantastic. Thank you. And we will hold questions to our question period and move on to Eric Batman. So Eric can screen share. And Eric is a senior civil engineer with Los Angeles County Public Works. In this capacity, he oversees the operation of public works, dams, spreading grounds, and seawater barrier facilities to provide flood protection and groundwater replenishment. And over to you. Great, thanks.
All right, thank you, and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for the opportunity to speak today about flood protection and stormwater capture in LA County, and specifically performed by LA County Flood Control District. Having listened to the presentation up to this point, I know earlier Michael mentioned talking about shifting gears. I think we're about ready to shift vehicles here. Spoiler alert, there are no farms in my presentation. So not a whole lot of farms in LA County, but that doesn't mean we can't capture some stormwater. So I'm gonna go ahead and get started here, and first just kind of talk a little bit about a brief history on the LA County Flood Control District. So it was established back in 1915 following a 4-day storm event that produced about 19 inches of rain in the San Gabriel Mountains, and it resulted in a pretty heavy toll on both life and property. And because of that, that occurred in 1914, and a year later, they decided to form this special district, California State Legislature. And the purpose of the flood control district was mainly twofold. Number one, reduce flood risk, and then number two, conserve water. And again, by conserve water, I mean capture water, not so much. Other times different water agencies talk about conserving water by using less water, but in this context, it's more capturing water and putting it in the ground for storage. So the flood control district is over 100 years old, and now it's actually part of LA County Public Works, which was formed back in '85, and it was essentially Public Works brought together the LA County Flood Control District, the road department, county engineer, into one, under the umbrella of one agency, which is Public Works. So I'm going to be talking today about these facilities that are owned and operated by the Flood Control District, mainly the 14 major dams, 27 dedicated spreading grounds, 22 rubber dams, which are really part of the spreading grounds, but I thought it'd be important to kind of highlight those facilities. And then also we oversee 500 miles of open channels. And again, pretty much all these open channels are engineered channels with heavy urban, in a heavy urban environment. So here's just a map of LA County, and on this map you can kind of see the red lines, which represent channels that are operated by LA County Flood Control District. You can probably see some blue lines; those are operated by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. Our facilities and the Corps facilities are highly integrated. We work very closely together to provide both flood protection and to capture stormwater for groundwater recharge. You can kind of see one of the things I wanted to point out, and I think my cursor will work, maybe it won't, but right in the middle of the map, you kind of have a light blue. Well, let me back up 1 second. All the different pastel colors are the groundwater basins in LA County. And I wanted to highlight the groundwater basins because that's really, the groundwater is where we store water in LA County, not so much in local reservoirs, but rather in the ground itself. LA County gets about 1/3 of its water supply from the ground, and really they get the remaining 2/3 from outside the county that they import from Northern California or the Colorado River. So storage really happens in the ground. And again, I wanted to highlight the kind of the light blue area right there in the middle, and then kind of to the southwest, there's like a pink area as well. That's the Central Basin and the West Coast Basin. And between those two basins have an estimated storage capacity of about 32 million acre feet. And I point that out because it's just to kind of put that in perspective. Lake Mead at Hoover Dam has about 28 million acre feet of storage. So right here in LA County, we've got more than the capacity to store the amount of water that Lake Mead has, which again, Lake Mead is the largest reservoir in the United States. So just what kind of puts things in perspective for LA County and how we really look to use the groundwater basins to store that water. Here's just kind of a schematic on our system. It's a very simplified version, and you'll see in just a slide here more how complex it really is. But in general, this is kind of how it's supposed to work. You know, it rains, water's captured at the dams. The dams attenuate, the flood risk, and then we release at a rate that we can capture downstream in the spreading grounds, which are located next to the rivers and channels, or even use a rubber dam and use the soft bottom channels themselves as areas that we can percolate and infiltrate that water. So this is kind of the simplified version of how it's supposed to work. This kind of illustrates the actual facilities and the complexity of the LA County Flood Control District system. And just kind of point a few things out here. We have some yellow ovals. Those are all the 14 LA County Flood Control District dams, kind of scattered in the foothills of the San Gabriel Mountains. And then you can kind of see the greenish, Army green color ovals. And those are actually the Army Corps dams. And you can tell these are highly integrated within our flood control system and stormwater capture system. So again, like I mentioned previously, it's really important that we work together with the Corps. We've got our, like the light green colored rectangles. Those are all of our spreading grounds. Again, 20, well, I'll get into that in a second, but 27 spreading grounds. And then we also have some blue rectangles, and those are recycled water treatment facilities that discharge into our system, because our system is not just solely used for the capture of local stormwater for recharge, but also recycled water. And then also there's some circles with X's through them, and those represent imported water discharge points. And again, for LA County, imported water is brought in from outside the region. And for our facilities, it's typically limited to water from Northern California, mainly because of the issues that the Colorado River has with the quagga mussels. And we're really looking to avoid bringing that into our system. We've just found that once it's in the system, it can be very difficult to deal with. So at this point, we're really limiting those imported deliveries from Northern California. So this just kind of captures the complex nature of the flood control district facilities, Army Corps facilities, import water discharge points, and also even recycled water treatment facility discharge points. So to talk about just some of the facilities, first I'll start with the dams. Again, 14 dams in LA County that the flood control district is part of. They were all built between 1920 and 1940. So they're all coming on their like 100-year birthday or anniversary, whatever you want to call it. In fact, the first one we built did celebrate its 100-year anniversary or birthday last year. So definitely some aging infrastructure, but we really focus on making sure these facilities continue to operate the way they need to operate. The storage capacity at these 14 facilities is around 107,000 acre feet. And one of the things that we really focus on continually is sediment management at these facilities. They are located again in the Angeles National Forest for the most part, in the foothills. And Angeles National Forest is highly erosive. And so sediment deposition is really an ongoing battle, if you will, at these facilities, especially after a recent burn. We see significant increases in sediment deposition following those events. We're always looking to make sure the valves operate the way they're supposed to operate, to make sure we can make releases, and then constantly evaluating and reevaluating for seismic upgrades to make sure they meet all the latest seismic requirements. Next up, here's just some photos of our spreading grounds. These facilities, we have 27 located throughout LA County. Total area about 2,700 acres. And as you can tell from the photos, in prime real estate in LA County, they're all surrounded by either residential areas or businesses, commercial areas. But we've had very good luck at making sure these areas are preserved for the purpose of recharging the groundwater basin, because they play such a critical role in terms of taking that water and putting it in the ground, which is really the storage in LA County. One of the things I wanted to mention, and I think Rosemary mentioned, kind of referring back to her presentation, geology is key. It really is. And all these locations that we have, the 27 spreading grounds, were selected based upon the geology. That's really a key principle. I know even now there's folks that have ideas for projects in LA County. They start picking spots, and it becomes clear that the geology is just not conducive for infiltration from the ground surface. So even where there are open areas that could potentially be a spreading ground, the geology has to match. The geology has to work. Otherwise, you're just kind of wasting your money. And it's just not going to pay off for you in the long run. But again, overall storage capacity at these facilities, we have about 23,000 acre feet. Most were built between 1930 and 1965. So again, they've been around for quite some time. And when they were originally built, LA County was much different in terms of available land and space. And things have changed quite a bit, so that, available locations for spreading grounds just aren't that prevalent. And so we really focus on these facilities and make sure we take care of these facilities. We're always looking to improve the spreading grounds by, say, increasing intake capacity, to try to grab as much storm water that comes through. You have peak flows, as folks have kind of even talked about today, And so you want to do the best you can to grab the water when it's there, because when it's gone, it's gone. You can't get it back. So trying to grab as much inflow as possible is key. Capacity in the basins is key, although there is a trade-off there where if you make these basins too deep, you run the risk that they may not dry out and allow you to do maintenance. And that's really a key concept. So it's kind of a balance between you want the capacity, but you don't want to go too deep, because then you can't do the maintenance and it kind of becomes worthless, if you will. And then the other thing we look at is percolation, and is there something beneath these sites that can be improved from a geologic standpoint? Can we go a little bit deeper and remove, say, a clay lens or things like that? But I think over the years, we've done a pretty good job of at least addressing that issue. And here's our rubber dams. We've got two types of rubber dams in LA County that we use. One is just kind of a long inner tube, like you see in the upper right-hand corner. These inner tubes are about 6 feet to 10 feet in diameter, and they just stretch across the river. The other type that we have are like a rubber pillow that lifts a gate. And so we employ both types, and they can be used for both diverting water into spreading ground, or they can be used to retain water in a soft bottom portion of a river to use the river itself as a spreading basin. But overall, these types of infrastructure are very versatile. You can inflate these. They're air-filled rubber dams. Back in the day, they were water-filled, but we found air-filled work much better than water-filled. But they can be filled very quickly within 30 minutes. They can be deflated very quickly within, say, 15 minutes, which is really important for making sure if you need the capacity of the channel back, if, say, the storm changes and you all of a sudden you're seeing more flows than you expected, you can allow that flow to go downstream and again resume and restore that capacity in the river itself. So overall, we really like these rubber dams. We do have just a program to systematically replace the rubber dams every 15 to 20 years. They're kind of like the tires on your car. Over time, they just do degrade and they need to be replaced. And just like when you're driving, if you don't really want to run that tire out till you have a blowout on the freeway, you really want to, be proactive and replace these facilities before you have that major catastrophe. And the same thing with these rubber dams. You don't want to have a lot of water behind them, and all of a sudden you have some major issue and it releases, this water downstream in an uncontrolled type fashion. So we do have a program just to systematically go through and replace these rubber dams. And interestingly enough, the first rubber dams we put in were made by Bridgestone, who made tires as well. Still makes tires for cars, but unfortunately they no longer manufacture rubber dams. They've gotten out of the rubber dam business, and so we're just looking for other manufacturers which are out there that can still provide the same type of facilities. So this is a breakdown of the types of water that we recharge at our facilities. On average, we put in about 200,000 acre feet of stormwater, and then we complement that with imported water, 65,000 acre feet, and then recycled water at 45,000 acre feet. I would say there's been a much larger push to increase recycled water recently for a number of reasons. Number one, imported water is becoming more expensive. Imported water is also becoming less available. And because of that, there's a big push and a switch from imported water to recycled water, which makes a whole lot of sense. And so it wouldn't surprise me if in the near future, that average for recycled water went from 45,000 acre feet per year to say 60,000 acre per year, and to see an equivalent reduction in the imported water numbers on this graph. Stormwater amounts we expect to remain about the same unless we come across some additional facilities that we can use to capture more stormwater. Just a few notes on our operations. So those are the facilities that we operate. In terms of operations themselves, I always say operations, it starts with the forecast. So we're constantly looking at a seasonal forecast, monthly forecast, weekly, daily forecast. In fact, earlier today, we had our annual meeting with the National Weather Service to discuss the upcoming storm season. Unfortunately, it's looking like it's going to be more La Nina, and they expect well below average for rainfall. We'll see how it goes. We'll still cross our fingers, but at least the current seasonal forecast isn't looking all that great, at least for Southern California. But then as there is a hint of a rain event, say a week out, then we'll start looking at the weekly and daily forecast. And then finally, we'll get to the point where the rain essentially is right on the edge of our forecast area in Southern California. And we'll start kind of watching the radar and watching the radar come in. And so how it kind of works is, the radar will lead to rainfall, hopefully, and then rainfall will lead to runoff and changes in reservoir elevations. And then when we see those flow changes in the rivers and channels, that allows us to activate our facilities to capture that storm water. And so we do have quite a network of both real-time rainfall gauges, real-time stream gauges, real-time reservoir level gauges, and we're constantly kind of monitoring all this information as it passes through. Before the storm gets here, we'll take a look at neighboring counties that also have this real-time rainfall information to kind of get an idea how much is it raining, what's the timing of the rainfall, what's the intensity of the rainfall, and that's all factored in when we're looking at capturing the water. When might it arrive? How much could we expect? How long do we expect it to last? Things like that. So it's all very helpful. So in terms of folks looking for projects, I think having monitoring information is really key as you operate these facilities. If you're looking to capture this in kind of real time during an actual storm event, I think that's really something that should be considered, as well as really good measurement devices to quantify how much water is coming in and how much storage capacity, say, you have left at wherever you're putting the water. So just one more quick note, it does take about 10 inches of rainfall in the mountains for the reservoirs to actually respond. The watersheds do need to get to a certain point of saturation before we'll even see any water at the reservoirs. But even with that being said, about half of our spreading grounds will activate regardless, during a storm event, will activate regardless of whether or not we're making a release from a dam, because there's a watershed in between the dam and the spreading grounds that generates a sufficient amount of water to get us out there to open the facilities and to capture it. And typically we'll really start, filling up the spreading grounds when we have to get to the point where we have to make releases from the dams for water conservation or stormwater capture purposes. So I think that's about it. Oh, wanted to mention one more time, working with the Corps is really critical during these storm events, just because their system is so integrated with our system that close communication is really key. And so we definitely work very closely with the U.S. Army Corps as we operate our facilities in conjunction with their facilities. And that's it.
Well, thank you very much, Eric. That was great. And you came in under the 20 minutes. So there's a time for a specific question to Eric. Look in the chat, see if anyone has anything specific or pop it in. Otherwise, well, I have a question that came up as I was looking at this. I mean, it's amazing the scale of what you're doing down there. And a lot of the questions we have about on-farm recharge and floodplain restoration is, how do we scale this? How can we move forward? Well, you've moved forward significantly. So one question would be, what about climate change? Is that going to cause you to rethink, have to change a lot of what you're doing, or?
So we did a study recently with the U.S. Bureau of Reclamation, trying to get an idea on long-term forecasting of rainfall, because that's really, our system responds to rainfall. And so once we had that information, we could get a better understanding of how might that affect how we operate our facilities. And the results were, generally speaking, the average rainfall for, say, downtown LA is expected to be about the same. However, and this, you've probably heard this already for other parts of the country as a whole, they expect more extreme events. The droughts are going to be more dry, and the storms are going to be larger and deliver even more rainfall than we've seen in the past. And that we really seem to take full advantage of our facilities during the larger events. But there is a point where if the storms are so large, it exceeds our capacity, and we end up losing a lot of that water that could be captured if the storm would have come in differently. Meaning, if you can space these storms out once a week for 4 weeks, we'll get all of it. But that's not usually how it works. It's like a 2-day event. And unfortunately, during that 2 days, it rains so much, it's such high intensities that it overwhelms the capacity. And as a result, we lose the water that we could have potentially captured just based upon how it falls. So we suspect with climate change, it could definitely lead to, even though the overall rainfall average will be about the same, there's a potential that if it does fall differently, that we won't be able to capture as much as we have been able to historically.
Right, and I think that's a lot of the focus with the flood in Floodmar, recognizing that the water we get is going to come in very different patterns. So other questions? There's a question unanswered. People have been answering questions in the chat as they go, but Phil, I have a question for you. So Phil, how do you think state administration and the legislature can help to transition to Sigma 2 to address all the challenges, not just some of them, all the challenges that you encountered and articulated in your talk? So Phil, do you have thoughts on that?
Yeah, I was typing out a reply to that. It's a tough question, and I'm not sure what exactly the answers are. I think one of the things that the state needs to make sure they have of right now is enough people involved with the review of the GSPs, and so that both in DWR and the state water board, so that people know that what they've put down, it will be taken seriously. And I think that I feel that, you know, one of the great things about Sigma is that it's a local law, and it creates local momentum to deal with these groundwater issues. But I think with a lot of the regional considerations that we have to be also willing to say, well, local may not be enough, you know, that we have to think about this in sort of the regional context. And so that should be part of the review process. And then I think that outreach is really important, and maybe, you know, these farmers and landowners and stuff grapple with a lot of regulations and that are conflicting a lot of times. And it would be good for some kind of strike team or something to be developed by the state that could go out and help folks and provide them a non-biased information and recommendations that and dig through a lot of these laws and stuff, not just Sigma, but just the whole bunch of them. Because right now, you know, you're hiring consultants and you're trying to figure it out. It's very discriminatory against small businesses and small landowners. And so it seems that it would be good if the state took a more activist role in sort of its interpretation and implementation of its regulations, not from the perspective of enforcement, but through the perspective of helping inform people.
Yeah. So Helen, on that point, do you see the need for the state to step in at some level, or more generally, the hurdles that you see to the widespread adoption of on-farm recharge, Michael, floodplain recharge? Are these things that really need to be dealt with in California at the legislative or administrative level, or is it more very local level decisions?
Yeah, for on-farm recharge, I think I'm living a little bit in a scientific or academic bubble right now. So, you know, I see hurdles from my perspective, but I don't necessarily have a full overview or good idea of really what are the practical issues of implementation on the ground. During the GSA stakeholder focus group discussion we had in the Floodmore Initiative 3, I think it was a week or two ago, there were some good hints that came up, like, for example, farmers don't necessarily have the equipment or technology to measure the water they apply on the field, which is definitely something that the State Water Board would like to see as, you know, as a reporting requirement. But there are most likely many other issues, and it would be great to get more feedback from actual landowners on what are they hesitant about.
Great, thanks. So I just want to let everyone know that we've hit the end of this session, and is Arit there to tell us what's just started? We're going to stay here, but first of all, I want to thank all the presenters. I want to thank the audience for attending. Great questions, great engagement. Thank you all so much. Clapping from me. And over to Arit to let you know what else is going on, but we will stay here.
Great. Thanks, Rosemary, and thanks everyone for these great presentations. Yes, we are at the 4 o'clock hour. And as I said earlier, those who want to stay on and continue this conversation, I think Michael is now our host. I think Tommy made him the host.
No,
Not
I'm
yet.
good to do it right now.
Okay. And Tommy is doing it so he can get ready for our happy hour, which will be at 4:15. And as I said, we'll have two conversations, one on the tribal water stories and one with the Merced team. So maybe what we'll do is close the official time for today. And those who want to stay on would love to. I saw that there were a lot of questions coming out in the chat, and we probably can't get to all of them, but we'll definitely track those and follow up with our presenters for our summary. So thanks everyone for presenting and for participating today and being part of this conversation. And Tommy, if you're still there and you want to put the Mentimeter, we can look at it and see what people had continued to say.
Oh yeah, I forgot about that.
Closing.
Coming in the chat, not so much questions as to our presenters. Great presenters. Thanks everyone. Great information. Thanks for sharing. So I echo that.
So,
Okay, so the poll.
so Michael, real quick, promote me back to co-host for a second. And then I can share, and what I will do.
Love the poll.
Let's see if it,
Oh, he's called CSUS. That's why I can't.
nope, the other one, it's the other one on there. I have two feeds, so I'm running from two computers there. So here, you know what I'll do? Hold on just a sec. So Michael, I'm going to give you this feed. And you should be able to click on that and share your screen, because when I go away, it's going to go away. So I think if you look in the link, it's the Menti link to the live results. You may have to scroll over to see it on there. And I put it to everyone so that attendees as well can use it to have a conversation piece.
It looks like I can't share my screen anymore. I made the CSUS presenter the host again.
Okay, hold on just a
I
sec.
tried to get on it, but it's blank, Tommy. It's not showing anything.
How
But-
about this
here
one?
it is.
Here we go.
Here we go.
There we go. Okay, everyone. Oh, hold on a second. So
so much
Michael,
for
let me, before I leave, because if I do it, so I'm going to make you host one more time. There you go. So Michael, you should be host.
Now, is there a way of
Okay.
unmuting everyone so that, I mean,
Yes, he has host now, so everybody should be unmuted if you choose to do so. And I did also undo that. So he has control. He has control of everything now. So be nice to Michael, please. Okay, I have to jump off. So thank you again. Have a great day.
okay, so first of all, Graham, I cut you off by going beep, beep, beep at the end of the break. So would you like to continue with the point you were making? If I can find you and unmute you, or can you unmute? I think everyone can be unmuted at this point, right?
Yeah.
I don't remember what I was saying. So if someone
But
can remind me.
bicarbonate, but
CO2 sequestration by groundwater recharge. Yeah. I've been saying for years, that's a nice little ripe project for research, in that it's not that hard to, with geochemical equilibria models, and half of you are using them, to account for the CO2 that's being stripped from the vadose zone by recharge. Now, the flip side of this is when we pump groundwater out, there is degassing of the bicarbonate, which puts CO2 back in the atmosphere. But no one's done a decent, as far as I can tell, CO2 budget that is tied to groundwater recharge. But it's conceivable, you could argue that, you know, massive recharge projects do end up sequestering a lot of CO2 on a timescale of decades to centuries. So, and whoever publishes the science paper on that, please cite me on it somehow.
Okay, so I'm getting dizzy trying to read these faint comments as they fly by. So if there's anything catching, I saw something that How can pilot and research work be scaled up and applied? A comment about, we need some venues for sharing. Oh, identify best venues for sharing study findings with landowners and local agencies. And I know the FloodMar network, I forget, there's all these different working groups. I forget which one I'm on, but there is an intent to make links so that people can come in and load results, links to their work. So I think everyone's in agreement. There's a lot going on, and there should be one go-to place where you can access information. And others have thought about that. Is anyone else on that working group? Okay, pick one. Over to Michael. Pick one and comment.
I guess I'll call back to one of Graham's comments looking about, the kind of purpose of the Vadostone modeling that we were doing. I think the comment was the most reliable way to measure changes or recharge to the Vadostone was looking at the groundwater levels. I completely agree. And we just note that what we are trying to do is get a reasonable estimate for a situation that doesn't completely exist in reality yet. We're looking at potential recharge on the floodplains. So what we want is a Vadostone model that kind of reasonably is accurate for a large region. We know it's not going to be perfect for any field scale analysis, and you would probably have to go back and kind of do a more sophisticated analysis for any particular project. I don't know if that kind of answered your comment or question.
I would just add that if you can get water table measurements along with your Vados measurements, they will be very complementary and reinforcing, self-reinforcing.
Absolutely.
And there's also the suggestion here. Why do they keep disappearing? It's honestly.
Tell me when I should.
Pause
There is
them.
a pause button, but I don't know when you want me
you're
to
in
stop it.
control of the pause. I get it.
Like here?
Okay, so state government established 3 experimental watersheds. There's tremendous value to the same people working in this. There's this almond grove that we have done so much in this one almond grove. So there's definitely value in people working together on a site. Do we need to establish, choose 3 experimental watersheds? What do people think about that? Or just let it grow organically? I know we've done some work on some of Helen's sites, and I'm sure Phil and Helen have worked on similar sites or the same sites.
Rosemary, Jenny has her hand up.
Yeah.
For
I can't
questions.
see it. Phil, Michael, can you just unmute people who have their hand?
Yeah, I don't think anyone's muted.
No, I can unmute myself. Thank you. And I don't mean to interrupt a conversation, but I did have a question that I think any of the panelists could answer. We're talking about spreading basins, we're talking about on-farm recharge, talking about floodplain recharge. One thing that these all have common is the need for land and working with landowners. So a few of those scrolling comments about connecting with landowners is from me. And so any recommendations, thoughts, considerations, of coming to scale, it's going to require a lot of land. And so what's the best path forward in working with landowners, finding incentives for landowners, compensation programs? Do you have any recommendations?
I can address that a little bit. I can address that a little bit. There's a work, at least down in MAGSA, there's been work on a water credit program that they've looked into on buying and selling of water within MAGSA itself. And I think that, I think people are realizing there's not going to be enough water to go around. And so there may be some benefits for them to sell water on certain land and not farm that land. So, I think that I don't know if the land is going to be a problem on getting a hold of as we move forward. I think there's also, we've looked at what are alternative uses we can do of land. We've looked at, putting in grants for solar production and other things. And I think the reality is that it's not going to be hard to get the land. It's just coming up to some processes and methods to give people some compensation for it when they don't use it.
Any other thoughts about the question of where do we get the land?
Yeah, I would agree with what Phil said. I don't think the land is necessarily the issue. I think it's really more who is managing that land and whether or not to convince that person to come on board. There has definitely been some fatigue in the farming community that some farmers are just like leasing their land to neighbors who still want to do farming. You know, that adds some complexity because you have to then, you know, write contracts. But I think as the GSAs or water districts are sifting through, you know, potential more recharge sites, you know, it will come down fairly quickly to just a handful where everything comes together.
Now we have a question, Arit, can you respond? Oh, she just did. Brilliant. Okay. So any other questions, comments? Otherwise, we can.
On the land issue, you know, some of the work we've done has shown that some land is much, much more valuable for recharge than other lands by a factor of at least 60. And I'm talking about Steve Maple's work in Sacramento County. And in the past, I've looked at that, and this also relates to the incised valley fill deposits that Rosemary referred to that were shown to be identifiable by the airborne electromagnetics. And I suggested at a land use conference and recharge A&R conference about, 4 years ago, you know, it wouldn't be far-fetched for some of these lands to be considered as recharge preserves. And that sounds very academic, but guess what? In Texas, they have such things. In a place as backward and not nearly as progressive as California, so people say, but in Texas, they do have, you know, in essence, recharge preserves. Now it's for the Edwards limestone aquifer, so people can relate to it perhaps much more easily. But it's possible in the future that it might make sense to have a special designation for some of these lands that are you know, imagine, you know, the price of lands being 60 times greater in one area than another. Well, I guess you could compare, you know, Central Valley land to downtown LA or San Francisco. I suppose maybe that's more than 60 times. But those are totally different land uses. So just a thought about recharge preserves.
And I would just add to that, when we're thinking about floodplain recharge, the topography is going to kind of control what areas can be potentially inundated with, you know, some human potential intervention. And a lot of the areas near the rivers are controlled by kind of conservancies and agencies that do basically hold the land. So it's really just identifying which areas you can build large enough projects over the correct aquifers. And that is a lot of what we're looking at, is specifically exactly where can we, you know, where do the topographic requirements make sense? And then where can we actually get the recharge deeper into the ground?
And Phil had his hand up.
Yeah, you know, this goes back to Jenny's question that we've all been sort of talking about with land. I think really the more important question is, where are we going to get the water? And I mean, of course there's issues like, I mean, flood margin is most basic. You know, Rosemary brought up with our team, you know, how do we define flood margin? We all answered kind of differently. And I mean, I think in its strictest definition, flood margin is about flood water, but then you can say, well, flood margin is about sort of water that came out of storms and went somewhere, and now it's kind of coming down the hill, and maybe it sat around in a reservoir for a while, and now it's flood water and we're going to use it. Or, you know, maybe it's, you know, some secondary water that is available, or maybe it's conveyed and traded and transferred water that came from up in Sacramento and is coming down to the San Joaquin. And so there's all these, you know, the exact definition of flood margin isn't really that important. But there's a lot of ways to convey water around and potentially opportunities to get it. But overlaying all of that, you know, on the benefit side is, you know, there is interest in conveyance and credits and transfers and trades, and it's growing, and try to facilitate and make it easier. But on the other side, it is the question of water rights, and how do you move around the water rights, and how do you deal with the water rights and work with the water rights, and it's a very arcane system, and it's a system that's really probably needs a real database overhaul so that one can get good numbers out of it, and it's the right first serve. Water rights are first serve, and so that just by definition is not really for the public good. And so you have this real, and then of course we're a litigious society where everything you do you can get sued for. So all those things combined make it really hard to get water. And originally when Don and I were looking at this back in our team back in 2011, it was like, well, flood water, it's available, no one wanted it, let's use it. But 10 years now, it's like flood water's not, no one's wanting to use it, now people want it. And now, since people want it, it's becoming more litigious. And so it's a real challenge. It's a real challenge for all these projects on acquiring the water.
Eric,
So, Rosemary, can I just put a pause in the conversation, because we have 2 breakouts where we probably have colleagues who are waiting to continue these conversations. So I'd like to suggest that we close this room.
okay,
And of course, that's up to you, Michael, since you're in charge. And those who want to join the Merced team or the Tribal Water Stories hour can go get your drink and rejoin. And I think these conversations and important topics that you're bringing up, we can continue in those spaces as well. And apologies for cutting the conversation.
okay, great. Eric, do you want the last 20 seconds?
Yeah, sure. I just had a quick question. I get the impression that the Central Valley, for the most part, is not adjudicated. And so I guess my question is, who would be running the show up there? I think down here in LA County, everything's pretty much defined as who's in charge, and it's set up in such a way that there is a monetary way to motivate bringing water in, storing water, and then when it's pumped out, somebody gives money to someone that holds on to it to get more, to buy more water, to develop projects that can put water back in the ground. But without that sort of system that's set up, for folks to invest money to recharge the groundwater basin but not get that benefit back, but say the neighbor or someone down somewhere elsewhere gets that benefit, I think that's a tough sell. So anyway, I was just going to mention that.
Yeah, and that was a comment. I saw Graham's keynote this morning said there's a lot of enthusiasm and positive feeling and let's collaborate, let's work together. But ultimately, how do you motivate people? How do you incentivize people? How do you reward people? Where's the whole, Anyone has a quick comment, or up to you, Michael? Are we gonna close the room?
I think we'll leave it open for a couple more minutes in case anyone has anything else on that before I close it.
I have to leave.
I'll just say a quick thing. I have been talking a lot about zoning for recharge lately. Any land use decision, assess it, and if it's a primo recharge location, change the zoning. No parking lot here. Go ahead.
I think the challenge with the water is not just where is the land, but what water can you potentially use? And we don't have a clear answer to that. So even for like a floodplain project, we're not sure as if you set back a levee and increase the recharge in a particular area, if that's something you need a water right for at this point in time. So
Helen, you were.
I was just saying I need to leave to pick up my kid from daycare. So thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.
Oh, I appreciate the nice comments on the recharge preserves. I should add that we just submitted a paper, a postdoc, Shilin Gao and I, where we modeled the benefits of recharging on one of these really highly permeable buried paleo valleys that Rosemary also referred to, showing that if you intensively recharge these things, which are the things that I would suggest could be recharge preserves, the regional water quality benefits on a multi-decadal to century timescales could be massive. In other words, if you want to remediate the declining water quality on the scale of, Tulare Lake Basin, it's usually assumed to be impossible, right? But by recharging in a preserved feature like this at high amounts. And yes, this would require moving water south of the delta in winter and so on. In theory, it could be possible to talk about regional remediation of the groundwater quality. I'll leave it at that. We hope the paper gets published, but it'll get published somewhere.
And your comment, question this morning, how do you motivate and incentivize people? Talking to one of the GSAs that are very close to where there's coarse grain deposits, and there are landowners there that recognize that there are communities struggling because of water quality issues. And because of the connectedness, they realize if they give up their land for recharge, they're not going to directly benefit, but it is going to benefit this adjacent community. And it's great. So we have landowners saying, here, use my land for this. I personally won't benefit, but I'm committed to doing something about the needs of this nearby community. So it's really great to see that sort of.
That's encouraging.
This Kamyar, I think that's great. And to help advance or incentivize the state funding for something like a groundwater or recharge preserve, I think we really need as a state to recognize aquifers as natural green infrastructure. And surprisingly, it's not, because prior to Sigma, it was basically private ownership. And so I think by recognizing it as natural aquifers, as natural green infrastructure, and their replenishment as a public benefit, that will open up the possibility of directing public funds for this purpose.
Kamyar, you've been saying that for a long time, and I always agree with it. How can we make it happen?
Well, I think I don't think there's lots of people. I've never heard people object when I raise it. I think it's just a matter of getting it into the resource code. And we've looked and it's not there. I mean, forests are considered that, floodplains are, wetlands are, riparian corridors are. We pay to restore these, the public does, but not aquifers, because until Sigma, it wasn't in that category.
Well, I'll step into this a little bit. Down in the Fresno area where I've been working, Kings Basin, under the McMullen projects is a big cone of depression, and that cone of depression has the carrying capacity for groundwater of about a couple of our California reservoirs, and big reservoirs. And so I don't know the exact number, but that, and it's a cone of depression, and so the water has nowhere to go. And so one of the things that they've been looking at pretty seriously is a water bank there, and I guess that's in a water bank you're able to, it's the water's not going anywhere in this location. They're able to monetize it. They're able to recover it. They can, as part of it can go to helping the sustainability of the groundwater in that area by leaving some behind, and then the rest of it can be used to help California manage their water movement up and down the area. And I guess that's, maybe, I don't know, in like these, these preserves that you were talking about, how do you monetize that? If you can track groundwater and quantify it and designate it for some use or some purpose, then you can get some value out of it directly through the recharge process, and through its storage and transport. But that may be more difficult because of the fact that it's a channel, essentially.
Well, I think certainly for private use, you want to have a good accounting system. But for a public benefit, you really basically want the 6 undesirable conditions of Sigma. You express them in their positive, they become the ecosystem services that a healthy aquifer provides. And that becomes the basis for providing public funding. And what that means is you have to be willing to leave some of the water that you put in there in the ground to replenish the aquifer. You can't put 100 units in and take 100 units out and claim that you've replenished the aquifer. But if you paid someone to put 100 units, but leave 20 in, that then becomes the public benefit. We do this in the YOLO bypass. We pay landowners to provide a flood as a flood bypass when we have high flows in the Sacramento River. Why couldn't we do that with landowners? And again, I think flood risk reduction for the public may be as big, if not a bigger driver of doing something like this than the groundwater replenishment. One major flood damage event could pay for this concept many times over. And so I think we need to come up with a compensation scheme and consider the aquifers as natural green infrastructure. The other part is, and that's why I like repurposing land use, the term, not land retirement or land fallowing, because it incentivizes landowners to stay on the land and put some of their land to other uses that can still provide income for them, maybe as a dedicated floodmar groundwater preserve, maybe as ecosystem habitat, maybe as an environmental water account like you described, Phil, where the resource agencies pay landowners to put water under the ground under high flow condition with a commitment that they'll use that water rather than divert it from the channel under low flow conditions. Then you get aquatic habitat improvements. So I think there's lots of opportunity here, but you've got to consider aquifers as natural infrastructure and put public funds toward that. Just as an FYI, the Prop 1 storage investment program does not include aquifer replenishment as one of the eligible benefits for those projects. And again, because that was written pre-Sigma.
Yeah, I guess I agree with everything you said there, Camiar. I guess the main issue, I guess, is monetizing it. And whether it's public or private, just because it's public doesn't mean you shouldn't monetize it, because otherwise it's just a tax. So
No, I agree. We have to be able to account and monetize it. I'm just saying it's not strictly a private water bank.
Yeah. Well, the one I'm talking about isn't strictly a private water. It's a GSA water bank, and it's not private either. But it's there's a way of bringing value back to the people who are participating, and I guess that's whether it's whatever the green infrastructure is, people have to be able to be supported off of it in the end.
I want to thank everyone for this participation. I think there's some concern that we are keeping people out of the two competing panels at this time. So I know we can talk about this for many hours, and I would love to have that conversation as soon as we possibly can. But I think I'm going to go ahead and close down this session and
go into the other two rooms and take over the conversation. That's
Okay.
Okay, great.
Thank you, everyone.
Rosemary,
okay. Thank you, everyone. Great.
Thanks, Michael.
Thank you all.
Thank you so
Bye-bye.
much.
I completely agree with everything you said, Camiar. That's a really important discussion. Love to have that soon.
Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.